Well, Mr. Franks, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, originally, you were planning on coming, then you delayed your trip here.
Yes.
And my understanding is you came at the request of President Basescu, who asked you to go ahead.
We had a request from President Basescu, from Governor Isarescu, and from Minister Polja to go ahead with the trip, despite the political situation.
Well, my question is that your basic conclusion was that there was little more you could do given the fact that there's no effective government in place here. You knew that before you got here. Wouldn't you have rather stayed home and watched the World Series? I mean, was this a wasted trip? Did you find out anything?
No, it wasn't a wasted trip. We were able to verify compliance with the targets in September. We were able to make good progress in discussion of some future structural reform legislation, pension reform, fiscal responsibility law, the changes to the unified wage law that are supposed to come into effect next year. We made good progress in those areas. And we also discussed with the interim government what a 2010 budget will look like when we have a government that can submit it and pass it. So it wasn't a wasted trip. We weren't able to bring it completely home, but we made good progress, and it'll make our return trip much quicker and easier.
And that's not been scheduled yet. That's pending a new government.
It will be pending whenever we have the policies that we can work on.
Now, in the three press releases, at least three of them that I saw today by the different groups, the group had some very kind words for the government. The progress has been made in social assistance area, for example, unifying public compensation, central bank got complimented, monetary policy, basic agreement, you say, generally where the country needs to go. But what's left undone is rather significant. That is the 2010 budget, the fiscal responsibility law, the pension reform. You say there's broad consensus on the fiscal target. Well, that's the target you established. So aren't we still lacking the basic crux of the resolution here?
Well, what we have had is an agreement with the outgoing government on the 5.9 target. That was agreed back in August. And we had discussions with all the major political parties this round, and they all supported, in principle, this idea.
Right.
They voted it in Parliament the other day that they would support this idea. Of course, now's the time to put your money where your mouth is. They've said they're going to support this. Now we need to see the votes necessary to actually put it into practice.
Is it fair to say, as I've seen, is it fair to say that this country will collapse without these funds coming in?
No, I don't think it will collapse. It's a question of where we are in the program. If the program were completely off track and we abandoned the country, there might be rather serious uncertainties that would result from that. But that's not where we are. We're simply talking about a delay of 4 weeks, 6 weeks, a matter of weeks. And in those circumstances, it should be relatively easy to bridge over to the next disbursements, as long as the policies get in place eventually.
And you met with all the political parties?
Well, we met with the three largest parties.
Labor leaders?
We met with labor leaders, entrepreneurs.
And is it fair to say that even though these are in different political camps, are they supportive of these measures? Are they willing to do what's necessary? Because there's some painful steps for their constituents.
Certainly different political parties have different ideas about how to cut the budget deficit.
Right.
Some would rather cut spending more, others would rather increase taxes more. There's a difference of opinion in the measures. And I'm sure that when we get down to the nitty-gritty with the new government, there will be some areas that are going to be quite difficult for them to swallow politically. That's always the case. But it's a good start to at least have them saying publicly that they support the target and they support the continuation of the program.
And how about public sector workers?
Well, the public sector size has increased dramatically in recent years, and the salaries have increased dramatically in recent years. That is not a sustainable move. So we've got to move that back to a more sustainable position. The share of public compensation in GDP has got to come back down to where it was a few years ago. So we're not talking about necessarily throwing all these people out in the streets. We're talking about trying to, over time, bring this back down to a more sustainable level.
And the labor leaders you met with understand this, or
Well, I mean, we have different labor groups that represent different groups in society, and they might have different views about this. Right. I don't think any labor leader that represents a group wants his group to lose their jobs. That's perfectly understandable. But there's an economic reality out there. People are losing their jobs in the private sector every day in Romania, and the public sector is going to have to take its share of pain.
The new estimate is 7.8% deficit rather than 7.5. Have you agreed to that?
Well, it's not a target.
Right.
Our target is not going to change. It's going to be 7.3. What we meant to say this morning was that our best guess is that they're going to miss the target by about a half a percentage point of GDP. So we would like to see additional measures to bring the deficit down to the 7.3. But let's be realistic. We're already in November. there's not a lot of wiggle room yet on how to get the deficit down further because we have such a short period of time.
Well, that missing the target by half a percentage point means you have to be a little bit more forbearant with the missed target. How much forbearance is the IMF willing to have looking forward?
When a target is missed, the country has to ask our board for a waiver in order for the next disbursement to go ahead. And the board, the first thing they ask when a waiver is requested is, what are you doing to fix this problem in the future so that it doesn't recur? So the first thing they're going to ask us, if they do miss the target in 2009, is what are they doing in 2010 budget to fix this? Hence the importance of the 2010 budget.
Are you confident that if all the steps that the government has already either laid out, maybe not passed in Parliament, but all the initiatives that they have on the boards, if they were all passed, would it meet your guidelines for next year? Are they sufficient?
I think we're in the right ballpark. There's a lot of...
sounds like no.
Well, I mean, I have to be honest with you. When you're talking with an interim government that doesn't expect to be in office in a few weeks, we don't get into the details quite as seriously as we might with a government that was still going to be in effect. So there's still some details that might have to be worked out there. But the intention is there, and most of the policies I think would be there. So we would be in the right range. That said, we're going to have to work on that with a new government, of course.
You made a very interesting comment last time you were here, and I don't know if you remember. You were answering questions from the press. 6 or 8 weeks ago this was. And you were asked what initiatives or what directives would the IMF make to the government? And you said, well, it was up to the government to decide exactly how to achieve these goals.
That's correct.
But I don't know if you remember, you prefaced it with a little parenthetical. You said, within reason, it's up to the government. And it strikes me as a curious idea, not to try to put you on the spot, but when you say within reason, is there a point at which you all say, look, we are the lenders, you have to follow these prescriptions?
Well, the reason I probably prefaced this the way I did was because all governments all over the world always tell you, we'll tackle waste, fraud, and abuse, and we'll improve the collection of our existing taxes, and therefore nothing else needs to be done. And that's not reasonable, because we in the IMF have experience with 186 countries across the world, and it's never that easy. And so if a government were to come to us and say, that's what we're going to do, cut waste, cut fraud, nothing else, and on the revenue side, we're just going to collect the existing taxes better, we would say, we don't believe that. It doesn't work.
We say that in the U.S.
Well, and it doesn't work in the U.S. either.
It doesn't work, right.
I mean, on the margin, you can improve tax collections,
right.
And on the margin, you can eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. But usually that takes years, and you only get a little bit each year of improvement. So we would put in a little bit. But if they say, oh yeah, 3% of GDP, no problem, we'll just cut out the waste and fraud and we're done. No, we would have to say, okay, be specific. Where are you going to cut? Who's going to lose their jobs? What kind of capital spending is going to be reduced? How are you going to change procurement to eliminate that waste? Those kinds of details that we would need to see. So that's what I mean when I say within reason.
Well, listen, I appreciate your staying tonight, and I appreciate your stopping by.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.
Now we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll have our nightly summary of stocks, and I'll bring you my Friday night commentary. I'm in a good mood tonight, so no complaining. We'll be right back.